Hello, Ferdinand here. So in this video we are going to talk a little bit about implementing licensing workflows in a Python plugin. So to basically implement a mechanism which validates a user. Before we go here into the details, there are two things to mention first. First of all, we already had a licensing example in the past in Cinema 4D in the Python SDK, but while it was not completely wrong, it at least had the capacity to mislead users a little bit in some aspects, and it also didn't flesh out all the details which you can flesh out there. And so therefore there's this new licensing example now, or in fact there are two new licensing examples now, and there's also a manual which accompanies this subject. So before there was only a manual in C++, now there's also a manual for the Python SDK itself. The other big subject is of course the scope or quality of implementing licensing. So the harsh truth is it doesn't really matter which language it is, that a motivated attacker will always be able to overcome your licensing efforts. It doesn't really matter how much effort you put into this or how much big of a company you are. In the end, all licensing mechanisms can be overcome. In our relatively simple scenario of Python, this gets even amplified because in Python you always have to send the source code as plain text to the Python VM so that it can compile it into bytecode. And this makes it relatively easy to modify your application. Cinema 4D offers the encryption of pip files, and also external solutions like PyArmor, but they are all relatively easy to overcome. So for PyArmor, there even exist one-button click toolkits, which you can just run on a PyArmor solution. It would just remove the encryption for you. And for Cinema 4D, it's even for a mildly competent attacker not very hard to remove the encryption of a pip file. So if you implement licensing, you should always implement it with this in the back of your head. So you shouldn't put too much time into this, because this can be cracked in any case. And but this does not diminish the value of licensing. So you can still implement licensing for this keep honest users honest reasons, so that people who might not have the motivation to actually go to a warrant site are not tempted to steal your plugin. And of course you can implement things like trial modes or demo modes or educational license, and all these things can be implemented when you implement some licensing workflow. Okay, let's dive into the code examples. So there are basically two code examples. This one here, this licensing one, and the simple licensing one, and they're very similar. The simple licensing example is sort of a reflection of what we had before as the licensing example. It just does some things different and makes some points here and there. The thing is roughly 400 lines. If you would subtract out here the comments and maybe some fluff which you do not need in your code, you could sort of implement this in something between 50 and 100 lines of licensing code for your actual plugin then. And the full-blown example does many more things. The thing is, I think 1,200 lines or something like this. Yes, roughly 1,200 lines. If you would subtract out here the comments, and again, the thing does multiple things at once, which you wouldn't have to do, but with this more complex solution like this, you can sort of estimate something like between 250, between 500 lines of code. What's worth mentioning is that both code examples are not just the licensing, but also both, other than the old example, contain an actual plugin which is licensed. But you cannot just ignore these in the effort estimations, because as we will see in a few minutes, in some cases you also have to respect the licensing in the plugins itself. Okay, let's jump to Cinema. And I've already started here Cinema, and as you can see, we have here some command line or some terminal output. And both plugins say they didn't found a license, and they say, okay, please open this license manager, which I've already put here into my menu. And this license manager, is not, other plugins often are very straightforward. So I usually make sure that they follow a very exact path so that there's not too much distraction there. This is here not really possible. The thing shows multiple things at once, which you could do in your licensing solution. You have then to pick and choose what you want to do. There is no real optimal path here. In general, this example is divided into sections. Here the license section is currently open, where you can then generate your license, and the data section, which is basically the data upon which this licensing is based on. So the two first fields here, this salt and file key entry, is data which comes from your plugin. So these are just two secrets which you generate. The salt is used to hash your license serial, so this is sort of, so to speak, the main secret of your licensing solution. And the file key is used to encrypt files when you, in case you decide to store them as. So in case you decide to store your license as license files on disk, so then they're stored as binary and encrypted with this file key. The remaining data, so username, user ID, and so on, they all come from the licensing API of Cinema 4D. So Cinema 4D exposes its own licensing information to the API, and this can, for example, be used to bind your data to, or your licenses to. There is absolutely no requirement that you use this data. So you could bind your license to anything you want, because the general idea of a license, of course, is that you have some verifiable data and which you can get on the machine when Cinema 4D or the application is booting. And then you basically regenerate the license key with this verifiable data, and when it matches with the license key the user has entered, then you sort of unlock the product. At least that is the most simple workflow you can do there. And one form of data you can base this on is, of course, something super old school, like the MAC address of the machine, which is currently running. But this, of course, has the disadvantages. As soon as the user changes his or her motherboard, this MAC address will also change likely, and then the license is invalid. So therefore, you need a little bit more stable data, and Cinema 4D can be one source for this, in this data which is shown here. But of course, you could also implement a license server yourself, or you could implement a licensed web service where the user has to authenticate via some HTML interface. This is, of course, all possible, but I did not go into these super detailed licensing solutions here. So the solution is based on the licensing data provided by Cinema 4D, and the username is quite obvious. This is the username which is stored in the Maxon ID account with which this current instance of Cinema 4D is running. The user ID is unique identifier again for this account, basically a collision-free version of the username. And the system ID is an identifier for the hardware on which the Cinema 4D instance is running. You can sort of think of this as the MAC address. It's just a little bit more stable than that. And so if a user would have one license, but for machines, then this system ID would change depending on to which machine the user has assigned this license at the moment in this running Cinema 4D on. The product ID is, as its name implies, an identifier for the product which is currently run. The user ID and the system ID are often used to bind license data to. So the user ID is usually always used. The system ID depends on if you want to do this. So if you would use the system ID, what you would effectively then do is you would then have a so-called node locked license. So the license for your plugin would only work on a particular hardware. And you can also sort of bind your license to the product ID, but verbatim, that's not a good idea because the product ID, so as you can see, I'm currently running here, or at least this is mock data, which is here shown, but this mock data says I'm running a Cinema 4D release commercial license. And if I would now shut down Cinema 4D and instead start the command line, then this would be another product ID. So if you would directly bind your license to the product ID, then this would only work for the exact product which you bound it to, and Cinema 4D basically splits into multiple products. And yeah, but what you can do with this field is, so here's this, for example, this commercial postfix. This could also be student or educational or NFR and so on. You can realize here binding your license to, so if you, for example, would issue an educational license, you could realize that this only will work with an educational or student license of Cinema 4D. I didn't do this here in the example, but in the manual, I sort of at least hinted at how you can realize this in practice. What I also should mention is, so currently, of course, here my name is not Bobby Tables. So this is here basically a demo mode at the moment, which, because I do not want to show you my actual data, but if you would run this plugin, it will show you your actual data, because then I will disable here this demo or obfuscation mode. Yeah, and the last entry is the account licenses, and these are the products and their number, which are in the id.maxon.net account, which is currently running this instance of Cinema 4D or the command line or whatever application the user is running your plugin under. And so here you can see what we already talked about. So this is here product ID Cinema 4D commercial, and here we can see the user has actually, 5 commercial licenses in his or her account, but then there are also commercial team render licenses, which, complete a different product ID. Here we also have here some educational licenses, and here we also have some floating command line license, and so on. You get the idea. You get all the products and the number of licenses which are in this account. Yeah, and if we now switch to the license tab, we basically have here some options. If you would implement this, you probably wouldn't need either of the options, because you would just choose one workflow of the multiple workflows which I demonstrate here. And there are primarily 3 decisions to make. So the first decision is one which we already talked about indirectly, is to which data you bind your license key. So out of which data you hash your license key. And so currently I have another check system or product ID. So what this thing is effectively doing is, again, this is not the real data which is shown here, but under the hood it uses the real data. It takes my user ID and takes the salt, and then basically uses the encryption or the hashing algorithm which I have implemented there, and then hashes this into this license key. And if I copy this license key and oops, gonna switch to Windows. So you can already see this is the same license key. If I would enter this license key under Windows, it would also work. But if I now enable here the bind this to system ID and I switch it back, it would not work anymore. And just in the other direction, if I would generate here the key which is bound to the system and bring it to here, it would not work either. Yeah, and the other options, of course, product ID, we already talked about it. It's usually not a good idea to bind your key directly to the product ID. You could, of course, do also many other things that you want. And the two other things you have to decide is, for one, the storage mode, where you store the license. So you have two options. Well, there are multiple more options than two. But the two which I implemented are store the data in a license file on disk or store the data embedded in Cinema 4D. They both have sort of advantages and disadvantages. When you store the data on disk, you could do this encrypted or unencrypted. Doesn't really matter at the end of the day. I went here for encrypted, but the big advantage of this is, of course, that a user can then just copy around this license file. So if you, for example, if you would generate here this licensing and bind it to a system ID, then it wouldn't really matter if the user can duplicate this license file how often he or she wants. The thing would still work just on this one machine. And the advantage of this is, of course, by the copying is that in a scenario like a render farm, they could activate or license their nodes without having to run a GUI, because as we discussed in the beginning, something like the command line is a different product than Cinema 4D itself. And if you never have run Cinema 4D, so the main application itself on the on this render node, you also cannot have run this dialog, for example, to generate the serial. So if you could just run your dialog on one machine and then copy all the license files everywhere, you could more easily license multiple nodes, if opposed to when you choose this other option, when you store the license information in Cinema 4D itself. So Cinema 4D has encrypted plugin storage, although the word encrypted is a little bit misleading. So the data is indeed encrypted there, but nothing prevents third parties, so others, from reading or writing data there too. So they only have to know the key where to write. So the thing is not per definition more secure than storing this in a file on disk. But yeah, you can also store data there. The disadvantages there basically, if you want to do this render node command line workflow for a render farm, for example, they would have to run at least Cinema 4D with a GUI once on each render node, so that they could put this data into this internal storage, because you have to start Cinema 4D with some GUI to sort of put this data there. The advantage of the internal storage is a little bit that if you do this with the license file, Cinema 4D has multiple preferences, directories. You have to write there some logic, so that when the command line is starting and the command line hasn't had generated a dedicated license file, that it sort of finds the correct place where the license file for a main Cinema 4D application has been stored, so that it gets its information from there. So you have to provide some extra logic. But in general, I would personally recommend the license file workflow. But you can also use the other one. The third option would be, of course, again, a web service where the actual data stored is on some server. But I didn't implement this here. And the most interesting and last decision to make is the activation mode. And as you can see at the moment, this is set to requires restart. So if I would now here click on activate, then it's like, yeah, Cinema4D has restarted to activate this plugin, and it will then indeed then restart. And as you can see now, both plugins say, because both the simple plugin and the complex plugin, they both read from the same license storage, and we now have here these two license commands and this license cube thing. As you can see, you can automatically restart Cinema4D, so you can do this relatively smoothly for the user, and this restart workflow is also a little bit easier to implement because it's less code, which is mostly what this simple example does. But we can also switch to does not require restart workflow, which ironically requires a restart while you're in no restart mode. And I will say yes, and no, we don't want to store this. And we will look a little bit at the code while Cinema4D is booting again. So when you implement any plugin, you usually have here this, or you have a register function at the bottom, or you do your registration directly here in the main context guard. And we have to a little bit understand how the boot system of Cinema4D works to sort of talk about the rest here. So when Cinema4D is booting, what it first does, it's loads and initializes its internal modules. So Cinema has many modules, for example, a core module, and these implement the functionalities of Cinema4D. So web communication, GUI, the Python VM, and many more things. And when it's done this, it starts loading the C++ plugins, and then the module which implements the Python VM in Cinema4D starts loading the Python plugins, which makes this issue which I'm talking about now a little bit less severe, because Cinema is mostly done booting when Python plugins are loaded. But we are still in so there's these phases in Cinema4D, and the phase which we are in while Python plugins are loaded, or while C++ plugins are loaded, is called C4D PL_init. So this is when the plugins are initialized. And in this phase, not all systems of Cinema4D have yet fully booted. The point where all systems have fully booted is C4D PL_start activity. This is the point where Cinema4D has fully booted and you can do whatever you want. When this is emitted, you still are seeing the splash screen of Cinema4D, at least usually. But you're basically at the end of the splash screen has just finished, and if you would just wait a millisecond, the splash screen would have closed and Cinema4D would open. This is the earliest point where you can do whatever you want in Cinema4D. While we're in the registration phase, which is under the hood C4D PL_init, which in Python is a little bit obfuscated, because in the Python, when this is emitted, it's the same moment when the modules are loaded, because technical details I'm not going into, but this is basically the moment when Cinema4D loads your pip file here, and it goes into name equals main, and then starts running your code. This is the moment when this is emitted. So therefore, when you are here in your register function, you should not do complex GUI operations. You should not do complex web requests. It doesn't really matter if this is with our internal APIs or with the Python API. You should certainly not start loading and running complex libraries, or you should not spawn new threads. So you shouldn't do anything which is complex in any shape or manner. First of all, this slows down the boot phase, and secondly, there is a real chance that you crash Cinema4D with this. Just because this doesn't happen on your system does not mean this will not happen on the system of the user. And this is also one of the larger flaws of the old example, because it did exactly this. It opened here a small dialog in this context, which in this form was fine, I would say, because it was just a small dialog. It was not very resource intensive, and I've seen this crash once, but in generally I think this does not crash so often, but it's not a good practice. So therefore, in this registration phase, we cannot open something like a licensing dialog. Therefore, we also have this restart and no restart workflow, because we cannot open here a licensing dialog. And if we are in this no restart workflow, so this is here one of the checks for this. So the logic is basically, when we are in restart workflow, we are reading a license from Cinema 4D. So this read licensing basically reads the license. This is just some abstraction which checks if either there's a license file on disk or if there's a license in the internal storage of Cinema 4D. And if it finds a license and we are in no restart mode, in restart mode, if it finds a license and we are in restart mode, then it registers the plugins. But if we are in no restart mode, it always registers the plugins. Doesn't matter if there's a license or not. The plugins are always registered, and the licensing workflow, I'm now going to call it, is then actually done at runtime. And this is fairly straightforward, and I would say this is also how the vast majority of quote-unquote professional plugins realizes, is you just implement then in the plugin hook itself the licensing. So I've implemented here this licensable cube thing, which is an object data plugin, and it has here this class field license type, and by default this is unlicensed. And there's multiple things with this. We will look in a second at it in Cinema 4D, but sort of the main idea is that in the major payload method of your plugin, which would be for object plugins get virtual objects, or would be for a tag plugin the execute function, there you check, where do I actually do it? Is license, I also added here this function called is license, which sort of abstract checking the thing. So when I say, the thing is unlicensed, then I refuse to do the major thing this plugin is meant to do. So in this case, because the thing is called licensable cube, the major functionality of this plugin is to generate a cube. And when the thing is not licensed, I just outright refuse to do this. And you can implement the same pattern here for command data plugin, and you can basically apply this to all plugin forms. Okay, let's switch back to Cinema 4D, and as you can already see now, we have here now 3 plugins, and so let me generate here this licensable cube thingy. And so the thing says at the moment I'm here, commercial license of this licensable cube thingy, and we can now also open here this license dialog again. And because we are now in no restart mode, we can say, please deactivate this plugins, and now suddenly this cube is deactivated, the cube is not generated anymore, and I just generated the text. I mean, you wouldn't do this. I just did this so that you can sort of test this also in a rendering environment, that you can visually see if the thing is licensed or not licensed. And what the example also do is they show you then multiple ways so how you can indicate that the thing is currently unlicensed. So first of all, of course, the major thing, just to repeat what we do, is we just refuse to do the major thing here, but we can also do stuff like we can replace the icon of the thing, so this log icon indicates that this is unlicensed, and we can also put here some text that is unlicensed, and we can also gray out all these parameters, and instead over here this get license button, which we could click, and then it opens the manager, and we can say then again activate, and then this basically all works. You wouldn't have to do all of these things at once. This is just as I said before, things you can pick and choose whatever you like the most. Yeah, that's pretty much it. The only thing which the thing also does is so that you can here, which again mostly makes sense when you have this no restart workflow. You can basically switch your license type so that sort of it at least hints at how you could, for example, implement here a plugin which behaves in an educational version differently or in a demo version differently than the commercial version. But what I didn't do there is that I bound, for example, that this educational version only works when you are also running an educational version of Cinema 4D. Yeah, I think that it is. When I stop the video, I'm probably going to remember something which I should have said, but yeah, I can't change that. I hope this helps. Happy coding and happy rendering. Bye bye.